There exists even today a small number of cultures based near the equator which wear little to no clothing because the average temperature is so warm, there is no real need or incentive to make clothes. This is how most of sub Saharan Africa functioned for most of history, with clothing being limited to simple loincloths to protect one's genitals from cuts and scrapes and infections. Therefore, it wasn't until Homo sapiens began migrating north out of Africa to colder areas that there was a motivation to invent clothes, with the discovery occurring around 75,000 BC. The first items of clothing were simple cuts of animal hides. Around 50,000 BC, the sewing needle was invented, which allowed a person to sew together pieces of hide using a simple thread made from hemp or another similar plant fiber. Textile material from animals differs from plant-based materials due to the fact it contains many small barbs, which can get caught on each other. By using water or a needle, one could smash the fur of a slaughtered animal until the barbs are all interlocked, creating a solid piece of fabric known as felt. Felting was a common early choice for clothes making due to the limited expertise and materials needed to make felt. Beginning around 30,000 BC, the Egyptians invented the fabric linen, which would protect them from the harsh desert sun, yet also be very light and breathable, unlike felt. Linen is made of fibers from the flax plant, making it one of the first plant fibers to be used as a textile. Making linen was quite easy and simply required a person to take a bundle of flax stems and then thresh them by pulling off the flax seeds and stem cover, exposing the flax fibers. The fibers can then be rolled together to form a continual strand of fabric known as yarn. Pieces of fabric could then be made by laying strings of yarn over each other in a crisscrossing pattern known as weaving. The process of weaving was made easier when in 6200 BC, the agricultural society living in and around the present-day town of Starcevo, Serbia, came up with the loom, which would provide the weaver with a large canvas on which to do their work. A loom has a frame which supports taut vertical pieces of yarn known as warp threads, which use stones to weigh them down. The warp threads then individually pass through the eye of a heddle, which separates out the warp thread so that a horizontal thread known as a weft thread can pass through to complete the weave. This basic loom from the Neolithic period is called a warp-weighted loom. The Incan civilization, who was in the Andes Mountains of modern-day Peru, invented their own ancient loom independently called the backstrap loom, which would, instead of using stones as weights, tension for the warp threads was created by wrapping them around flexible sticks that served as a warp frame. In 6000 BC, herders in the mountains of Iran found an interesting variety of sheep that was woolly rather than short-haired to protect itself from the harsh mountain winters. The herders would use the wool locally to make yarn, but it had not spread outwards yet. Around 4000 BC, in the Yellow River Delta in China, people began to harvest silkworms and use their silk to make yarn. Silkworms build their entire cocoon out of the prized silk, meaning one worm is quite productive. Silk became the standard fabric in ancient China, but like wool, it was slow to spread. Around 2500 BC, the Indus Valley civilization in India began cultivating cotton to use as their yarn. Wool finally made its push into Europe, replacing felt around 1300 BC, coinciding with the start of the Iron Age and the invention of iron shears, which made it much more practical to collect a sheep's wool. In 327 BC, Alexander the Great invaded India with his mighty Macedonian army. The soldiers' heavy wool clothing was not suitable to the hot and humid subcontinent, so they quickly adopted the much lighter cotton fabrics used by the Indians, bringing back cotton to Europe and beginning a modest trade for cotton as warm weather wear. A much larger trade began in 114 BC when the Han Dynasty in China opened the trade of silk with the Parthian Empire, which was an Iranian civilization located strategically between Europe, Egypt, India, and China. In 30 BC, the Romans conquered Egypt and extended an official trade envoy to China, beginning what we know today as the Silk Road. The Silk Road passed through strategic locations such as Anatolia and major cities such as Samarkand, which served as a center of science and commerce. Silk was not the only commodity Europeans could buy from China that they couldn't produce in Europe, and it was joined by tea, dyes, perfume, porcelain, paper, and gunpowder, while the Chinese mostly just requested silver. By the year 300, China had lost its monopoly on the silk trade as growers in Japan and had acquired silkworm eggs from mainland China, and by 552, agents from the Byzantine Empire were able to smuggle enough eggs out of China to begin production as well. The Crusades, beginning in 1095, saw the spread of silk production to the Arabs as well as to Europe, primarily in northern Italy at the terminus of the Silk Road, due to the frequent handing off of Byzantine back and forth between, due to the frequent handing off of Byzantium back and forth between the Christians and Muslims. Islamic rulers in Central Asia began to try to establish a monopoly in trade, and the Silk Road fell out of service until the invasion of the Mongol Empire in 1207 of Asia, who reestablished the Silk Road and offered security by nomadically patrolling the route. Mongol diplomats would come to Europe in 1271 and invite a delegation of Europeans headed up by Marco Polo to travel on the Silk Road with them and experience the Far East for the first time. Marco Polo was Venetian, and the Republic of Venice at this time had become incredibly powerful due to the silk trade. The prestige gave Marco Polo the opportunity to meet with Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor, and on his return to Venice, he became a celebrity and successful merchant. The dominance of Italian silk saw it replace wool as the preferred fabric in southern Europe, giving Britain the opportunity to become the major provider of wool for the colder climates of the north by leveraging the spinning wheel, which greatly sped up the process of yarn making that had just been introduced to Europe by Muslim traders, and who in turn got it from the Chinese, who invented it all the way back in 1090. In the 1340s, a massive wave of the plague came from rats stowed away in cargo along the Silk Road, which were carrying fleas infected with bubonic plague. The plague became known as the Black Death because it was so deadly, ultimately killing 125 million Europeans and significantly altering the demographic trajectory of the continent. This, on top of Turkmen raids on the route, led to the collapse of the Silk Road and the beginning of a period of isolation and stagnation for Europe. Little trade occurred between European kingdoms. A great example that widespread trade did not really exist unless it was with a faraway power trading in luxury goods. The two major lasting consequences from the road was the first use of the gunpowder technology and the creation and refinement of guns, something that would let Europeans begin to exert unequal influence on the rest of the world. And second, the religion of Buddhism flooded into China from the Kushan Empire, which had been an empire in northern India, becoming the predominant religion there. While most Europeans had fallen under an oppressive system of feudalism by the 1400s, small city-state republics persisted on the Italian peninsula due to their protected geography. These city-states continued to become more and more wealthy from the silk trade, which necessitated the invention of banks to store the money and created a thriving market for artists and musicians beginning the Renaissance. This success began the philosophy of mercantilism and saw the Italian republics begin to finance exploration voyages to reopen trade routes with China and India, this time over the ocean to avoid hostile Muslims in the Middle East. The wealthy Italian merchants of Venice, Genoa, and Florence demanded luxury silk clothes, and a manufacturing center for weaving was established in Lyon, France, to utilize cheap French labor, beginning the rise of the influence of mercantilism in Europe that would sway royal strategies and ushered in the Renaissance for the rest of the continent. Beginning in the 1600s, beaver pelts came into fashion as accents to silk clothes in Europe, and a fierce trade of trapping began in the vast North American wilderness where European powers, France and Britain, would compete for influence. The French had an early advantage over the British because they forged many alliances with local native tribes who showed them how to make canoes and helped them navigate the unknown terrain. The British, however, had one powerful ally in the Iroquois Confederacy, which was a league of powerful militant tribes in the northeast of the US and Canada. British trappers and explorers aided and armed the Iroquois Confederacy in a campaign against the French and their tribal allies in what became known as the Beaver Wars, where the Iroquois defeated the smaller tribes and forced them west, establishing a short-lived but politically important entity. Starting in the 1700s, more advanced looms, known as treadle looms, began to be used, which allowed an operator to sit and use their feet to adjust the reed, which was a comb which separated the strung through warp threads so that the weft threads could pass through. Weft thread rolls began to be placed inside a shuttle, which allowed the operator to quickly send thread through the opening created by the reed. Although the British lost their American colonies in 1776 revolution, this was simply an annoyance to them as the British Empire now stretched across multiple continents, including land in India rich in cotton acquired through the East India Company. The publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which defined capitalism, was adopted by the British, who could use cheap Indian cotton and the principles of free market forces and private ownership to establish a thriving textile industry, which in 1785, Edmund Cartwright utilized the power of water wheels to create a powered loom, increasing production efficiency and beginning the Industrial Revolution. Beginning in the 1790s, American inventor Eli Whitney would work on patenting his invention, the cotton gin, which would speed up the process of separating cotton fibers from their seeds. Eli Whitney was born in 1765 in Massachusetts. His mother died when he was 11, and his father remarried to a woman who Eli did not get along with. When he was 14, the Revolutionary War broke out, and he began a successful nail manufacturing business operating out of his father's workshop to help aid the war effort. Despite evidence that Eli was a gifted entrepreneur and inventor, his stepmother forbade him from attending college, so he had to save up for his own tuition to Yale, and then he graduated in 4 years. He then expected to go to law school, but was broke and couldn't afford admissions, so he instead agreed to take a job in South Carolina as a private tutor for a wealthy family. He never made it to his intended destination, however, as on the voyage south, he met Catherine Greene, who convinced him to instead travel to her plantation called Mulberry Grove, located just north of Savannah, Georgia, so that he could instead focus on his passion of inventing by helping her come up with a way to increase cotton production, which became the cotton gin. By all means, Catherine Greene was a genius herself who understood both physics and politics, and if she had lived today, there is no doubt she would have become a successful scientist or inventor. But at that time, she was limited in what she could do as a woman and was overshadowed by her husband, Nathaniel Greene, who had been a war hero during the Revolution. During the war, Nathaniel was defrauded by fake suppliers who failed to provide his troops with the supplies he ordered, causing him to have to take out large amounts of debt, giving him and his family a negative net worth. To thank him for his service, the government had granted him Mulberry Grove, and he hoped to build it into a successful plantation in order to pay back his debts. While Georgia had initially been set up as a backwater territory for debtors to move to, interest from New England merchants and elites to begin a plantation economy similar to the one in South Carolina gained traction with efforts spearheaded by Connecticut-born Governor of Georgia Lyman Hall. Nathaniel may have been too motivated to improve the plantation, and he died unexpectedly from heat stroke while working outside, leaving Catherine a widow. Part of Catherine's motivation to support the invention of the cotton gin was to help assist the transition of Mulberry Grove from slave labor to market labor, a trend that was widely expected to occur in the American South in the near future. The cotton gin instead had the opposite effect and suddenly made American cotton competitive at a global scale, causing the British to begin buying, increasing the perpetual demand for slave labor. In 1804, Frenchman Joseph Jacquard invented an add-on to the treadle loom called the Jacquard machine, which would allow operators to insert different punch cards, which had differing heddle eyes and could be switched between using the feet to make more complex designs. The use of a unique punch card to control which warp threads to let through and execute unique design using the same loom served as the starting point for all modern computing. In 1810, American businessman Francis Cabot Lowell traveled to Britain for the stated reason of visiting his family and improving his health, but the real reason was that Lowell wanted to steal the trade secrets of the British on how to create the power looms. Lowell was the son of a prominent revolutionary family, and he detested the fact that Britain made all of America's finished goods and that Americans were simply resource extractors. This sentiment was commonly shared and was demonstrated by the Embargo Act of 1807, which placed restrictive trade embargoes both on Britain and France in order to develop an American manufacturing base. The embargo angered the British and caused the War of 1812. Shortly before the war, Lowell and other Americans were deported from Britain and thoroughly searched to make sure they had not stolen any intellectual property. They found nothing on Lowell because they did not know he had a photographic memory and had to memorize the complete design of the power loom. When Lowell returned in 1814, he established the first American power loom mill in Waltham, Massachusetts, a huge success, although he unfortunately died 3 years later from pneumonia. His business partners then established a second larger mill on the Merrimack River, with its own town being established, which they named Lowell in its honor. Increasing adoption of power looms in Britain led to the power loom riots of 1826, where an organized group of disgruntled manual hand loom laborers, known as Luddites, formed out of fear for their livelihoods and set out to destroy as many power looms as possible. One hand loom worker named John Bullock decided not to resist the transition to power looms and instead worked to create his own improved loom, known as the Lancashire loom, in 1842, which could now be powered by a steam engine. The Lancashire loom was a huge success and really only needed human intervention when sending the shuttle through the warp. Following issues with his cotton gin patents, Eli Whitney had not become wealthy like he hoped, and he set out to fulfill a government contract to furnish 10,000 muskets for the U.S. military. Eli fulfilled the contract by utilizing his second revolutionary invention of interchangeable parts, where he made many iterations of the same musket parts through the use of molds. The concept of interchangeable parts carried over to the power loom and allowed American machinists to create the Northrop loom, which was fully automated, including the sending and resetting of the shuttle, with human intervention only needed to swap out spent weft threads. Prior to large-scale immigration, the United States suffered from continual labor shortages, which caused wages to be high and businesses to automate. These motivations were not present in Britain, as labor was abundant and cheap, so the fully automatic Northrop loom never really caught on. The automated mass production that began was limited to the sheets of textiles themselves, and at this point, laborers still manually sewed the pieces of textile together to form clothes in smaller clothier shops. This changed following the mass adoption of the sewing machine in 1830. Now, anyone with a modest amount of capital could buy a sewing machine and start a successful sewing business. At the end of the 1800s, as Jews began to feel heightened persecution in Europe, many moved to America for a better life. Like the new Irish and Italian immigrants, they settled in New York City. Although unlike the untrained Irish and Italians, who had been peasant farmers previously, the Jews had been denied land ownership in Europe and thus became urban dwelling professionals, with tailor for the wealthy being one of the trades most dominated by the Jews. Many Jews already owned a sewing machine, and they worked together as an ethnic community to establish a powerful garment industry in New York City that would employ thousands of women in one of the first roles widely available for them outside of the household. Although the garment industry caused the city to flourish, there were very few regulations at the time, and textile companies found it very easy to manipulate and mistreat the predominantly underage immigrant female workforce in pursuit of profit. This disregard for worker safety became epitomized in the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which killed 146 garment workers. The force of 123 females, overseen by 23 male managers, all perished in the fire due to a lack of fire escapes and doors, which locked from the outside. The tragedy resulted in the mass unionization of American textile workers, the collective rising of wages, and the resulting exit of the industry to oversee markets to utilize cheaper labor, following the same path as the British, who had fallen behind in textiles to the Americans. The Americans now fell behind to Asian nations such as India, China, and Bangladesh, where clothing makes up 77% of Bangladeshi exports. Between 1930 and 1970, the synthetic fibers of nylon, polyester, and spandex were introduced and mixed in with existing natural fibers, primarily cotton. The introduction of textile manufacturing is an easy first step for a nation to industrialize, and it is common to see the title of major exporter pass between nations as countries develop and advance beyond this somewhat primitive manufacturing. This never-ending stream of cheap labor ensures clothing prices are low, allowing wealthy nations like the United States to develop cultures of fast fashion, where it is common to own lots of clothes that are only worn a few times each before being discarded. Beyond being wasteful and harmful to the environment, demand like this creates an environment where foreign workers become exploited to maximize production. In 2013, disaster struck Dhaka, the capital city of Bangladesh, when the Rana Plaza garment factory collapsed due to inadequate structural integrity, causing the deaths of 1,134 people. The event led to public outcry in the U.S. over the existence of sweatshops related to fast fashion and a boycott of retailers such as Sweden's H&M. In response, the government of Bangladesh instituted labor reforms, which improved working conditions but consequently led to a rise in costs. In the future, we can expect textile production to gradually shift to new labor markets, primarily on the African continent, to take advantage of what will be the world's most plentiful and cheap labor supply.